Will you join me in a word of prayer this morning? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. It is officially the 12th day of Christmas. If you count them, start on Christmas Day and count it today. Today is day 12 of Christmas, and tomorrow is officially Epiphany. Although we don't usually celebrate all 12 days of Christmas anymore. I don't know if you did in your family. That's something from generations gone by. But I did watch a documentary this Christmas season about a Tudor Christmas. In other words, what was Christmas like back in the days of King Henry VIII and the Tudors of England? And so this one was called Lucy Worsley's 12 Days of Tudor Christmas was the documentary. It was on PBS. And it talked about all those Christmas traditions back from a day before people in Europe celebrated Santa Claus or even had a name for Father Christmas. It was before a lot of the traditions that we're used to today. King Henry VIII lived 500 years ago. It was the same time period as Martin Luther lived in Germany. It was the time period in which Christians in Germany were just starting to bring live trees into their house and decorate them for Christmas. But that tradition had not spread to the rest of Europe yet, much less the world as it has today. And so they had a lot of different traditions. In fact, the tradition of gift giving wasn't even a common part of their Christmas for regular common people to give gifts to one another. The song that we're used to, the 12 Days of Christmas, well, that doesn't come along in England until 250 years later during Victorian England is when that's written. But back in these days, that wasn't their common practice. Instead, for Christmas, in the Tudor courts, what they did was they had carnivals outside. They played yard games like tennis and bowling, which they didn't get to do the rest of the year. And they didn't eat ham and turkey and things like that we do. They had whole boar's head for their Christmas dinner. And they had carols, and they sang about it. If you want to know more about 12 Days of Tudor Christmas, you can watch it yourself. Lucy Worsley's 12 Days of Tudor Christmas on PBS. It's streaming live. Feel free to go out and watch it. It's free. But one of the things I was struck by is even though they don't have a regular gift-giving practice, or they didn't back then where normal people gave gifts to family and friends, there was one day of the 12 Days of Christmas where they did do some gift-giving, but it was something particular and peculiar to the king's court. And so all this was taking place in Hampton Court Palace, where King Henry VIII called his home. And he would have all of his nobles and his courtiers and the emissaries who came from other kingdoms would bring him gifts at one particular day throughout those holidays. And he would give gifts to them. And so the historian who was doing this documentary went back and looked up the archives, the actual naughty and nice lists of King Henry VIII. The list of who gave him what gifts and who he gave gifts to. And what they determined, looking at all these lists during the time of his reign, from the time he was crowned king to the end of his reign, is that every Christmas, he received more than he gave. It was common for King Henry VIII to make a profit off of Christmas. Well, this is really fascinating for me to learn about some of the formalities of court life. I was not born in a king's court, and I imagine neither were you. And so I was really fascinated to learn a little bit about this, what Christmas was like 500 years ago in a king's court. And mostly I was fascinated because see some of those formalities taking place in our gospel lesson for today. Our gospel lesson, and what we're going to focus on for this sermon, is from Matthew chapter 2. You have it in your service folder on page 5. And it's when the wise men come to the king's court to worship Jesus. We call them wise men. That's how it's translated here in your service folder. But if you were actually looking this up in the ESV translation, there would be a footnote. At the bottom, it would say the Greek word is magoi, which we usually just bring into English as magi. And so you've heard that. Magi. And our carols, traditionally, sometimes they're called kings, but we know they probably were not kings because the Magoi weren't kings. The only ancient use of that word in the scriptures is in the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament in the book of Daniel. Magoi was the name for the courtiers and the advisors of King Nebuchadnezzar in his court. And so that's probably who these guys are. Matthew tells us they came from the east. That's where Babylon would have been. These are probably courtiers who come from Babylon or somewhere like in the east. They're noblemen or they're advisors in a king's court, and they've come as emissaries to bring their gifts to a king. Now, even though Christmas has changed a lot in 500 years, the way we celebrate with Christmas trees and gift giving, particularly on Christmas Eve and Christmas, and not celebrating all 12 days of the year, and not playing tennis or dart bowling. I don't know if anybody here did that on Christmas. It's changed a lot. One thing that surprises me, hasn't changed much, is the life of a king and his court. Because the life of the king and his court in the days of Tudor England and King Henry VIII in the 16th century AD is remarkably similar to the life of a king and his court in Jesus' day in the 1st century AD, and remarkably similar to the life of the king and his court 9 centuries BC in the days of Solomon. And so let me read to you a little bit from the days of Solomon's reign and a practice of gift giving that took place in his courts. This is 1 Kings chapter 10, beginning at the first verse, and I'll read 10 verses to you. It says, "Now when Queen Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with some hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with very great routine, with camels bearing spices and much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all of her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, the burnt offerings he offered in the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. And she said to the king, the report was true that I heard in my own land of your words and your wisdom. I did not believe the reports until I came and saw it with my own eyes. Behold, the half was not told to me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass all that I heard. Happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you over the throne of Israel. Because the Lord God has loved Israel forever. He has made you king to execute justice and righteousness. And then she gave the king 120 talents of gold and a very great quantity of spices and precious stones. Never again has such an abundance of spices come as these that the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. That's 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. These emissaries coming from the courts of Queen Sheba had come with her, all her royal courtiers, and they come and they brought gifts to Solomon because they saw his splendor and they heard his wisdom. They saw the opulence and the prosperity in which he lived, and they offered to him gifts, gold and spices. And they gave it to him, and they went home. They gave to the king much more than anything they took away. That's the way it was in the days of King Solomon in the 9th century BC. That's the way it was in the days of King Henry VIII in the 16th century AD. These emissaries and courtiers and nobles of the king brought him gifts at this holiday season, and they took home far less than what they gave. It's the same kind of thing, I'd venture to say, is going on in our gospel lesson for today in Matthew chapter 2. These courtiers, these emissaries of the kings of East, are coming to give honor to King's court. Did you notice they didn't come to Bethlehem first? They didn't come to Bethlehem first because Bethlehem doesn't have a palace. Bethlehem has no courts. Bethlehem has no king. The king is in Jerusalem. And so they came and went to the king's courts. They went to King Herod's courts in order to give their gifts. But wasn't it a surprise to King Herod to find out the gifts they were bringing were not for him? He wasn't very pleased to find that out. I'd venture to say that King Henry VIII wouldn't have been very pleased at Christmas to find out that somebody bringing gifts was not bringing it for him. Same thing for King Herod. And so King Herod asked them who they're bringing their gifts for. Well, it's for a new king that's born king of the Jews. So King Herod consults with his equivalent of the Magi, his scribes and chief priests, and asks them what's going on. And they tell him the verse from the prophet Micah. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. From you shall come one who would be ruler to shepherd my people Israel. Matthew chapter 2, verse 6. King Herod passes that along to the Magi with this invitation. Go find this child who's the king. With the suggestion that he's going to come too and follow this long-standing tradition of bringing this king some gifts. Although we find out later in Matthew's gospel that that's not what Herod intends to do with Jesus. But we'll leave that story for another time. Let's just follow the Magi, because they do what Herod says, and they go to Bethlehem. And the star leads them to right over where Jesus was, and then they do what they came to do. It's in verse 11. They fell down and they worshipped him. They opened their treasures and offered to him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. But unlike the courtiers in King Henry VIII's holiday celebrations, and unlike the courtiers and the Queen of Sheba in Solomon's day and in his courts, these courtiers went home with far more than they gave. They do the same thing as Queen Sheba did. They gave gold and spices, but they went home with far more than they gave. Well, how can I say that? They went home with far more than they gave. What did they go home with? To be honest with, what did Mary and Joseph have to give? That's what's so interesting about them giving their gifts to this Jesus. In the account I read to you from 1 Kings chapter 10, when Queen Sheba and her courtiers bring their gifts to Solomon, it's because they've seen the opulence of his court, all the way that his courtiers and his nobles are dressed. But here these Magi come to Jesus, and there is no royal court. There are no nobles. There's nobody there except the little child and his mother. When the attendants of the Queen of Sheba looked at all of Solomon had, they saw food on the tables, they saw a royal palace, they saw he lived in prosperity that they couldn't imagine. When these Magi came to Jesus, there was no palace. There was no fancy food on the table. It was just a humble little home in a shepherding village called Bethlehem. When all of Sheba's questions were answered by Solomon, she was overwhelmed by his wisdom that he could answer everything for her. When these Magi came to Jesus, I don't imagine he could answer anything. In fact, his whole vocabulary might have been made up by Emma and Abba, which is the Aramaic equivalent of mommy and daddy. He was barely even 2 years old, if that, when they came. So what could they have gone home with? What could Mary and Joseph have given them? Well, maybe not tangible things that they would put on their camels and fill their sacks with, but they went home with a message from the Lord. Well, they do get a message at the end of this lesson. Verse 12 says, being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went to their own country by a different way. They found out Herod's not a good guy, and he's not coming to bring gifts to Jesus. But that's not the message I'm talking about. They went home with a message from the Lord, and the message was this. The word about the Christ from the prophets of Old Testament Israel is true. The word about the Christ, that he would be born in Bethlehem, is true. But not only that message is true, all the words about the Christ from the Old Testament prophets of Israel were true. This is the message they went home with. The message that the words of Isaiah, like our Old Testament lesson for today, is true. Your Old Testament lesson that's found on page 3 of your service folder began with these words from the prophet Isaiah. Arise and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord arises upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you, and nations. That's the word for the Gentiles. The Gentiles will come to your light. This is what they went home with. The assurance and the faith that these words of the prophets were true, meaning that this light was for them. Paul talks about this in the epistle lesson for today. Just so that we wouldn't miss the mystery and the surprise of this. And so if you look at Ephesians chapter 3, verse 4, which is on page 4 of your service folder, Paul writes, "When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed through his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. This mystery is that the Gentiles, the nations, are fellow heirs. They're members of the same body. They're partakers of the promise of Christ through the gospel." That's what these men went home with. As they left Jesus, they left their gifts of gold and of spices, but they went home with so much more, because they went home with the invitation that they were a part of this promise of the Christ through the gospel, and that his light was shining upon them as well. One of my favorite 12th day of Christmas devotions comes from this book. It's a book called Watch for the Light. There in Isaiah chapter 60, the Lord said, "Arise, shine, for the light of the Lord dwells on you." This is called Watch for the Light, and it's an Advent devotional that goes from the beginning of Advent all the way through the 12 days of Christmas to Epiphany. And there is a 12th day of Christmas devotion in here. Actually, it's not a devotion, it's a poem. It's a poem that's written by a renowned poet of the 20th century who just happens to be from my hometown. His name's T.S. Eliot. He's from St. Louis, and so it's one of the reasons I like the poem. But I like what he does, thinking about the Magi. His poem's called The Journey of the Magi. I've shared it in different venues here at Holy Cross before, so maybe you've heard pieces of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you today, but I do want to read the end. T.S. Eliot, this poet, imagines that he is one of the Magi, who years later, decades later, is looking back on this event of when he went to Bethlehem to see the Christ child and remembering it. And at the end of the poem, he talks about what he took home. He writes this: "All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again. But this sat down. This sat down. This. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was birth, certainly. We had evidence, and no doubt. I had seen both birth and death, and I thought they were different. But this birth was hard, bitter agony for us. Like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death." T.S. Eliot. He's imagining that these Magi went home with both a birth and a death, personally. A death to the sinful, selfish ways of life and the opulence of the palace life that they were so used to back in the East where they came from. And they had a birth into a new life of faith because they had seen the true light and the true heavenly riches that had come in the Christ. They were dead to their old ways of life and the gods they used to clutch, and were alive to a new God in Christ Jesus, and faith that came through the Christ, so that they had only one God now, was the one they had the privilege of bowing before and seeing incarnate in the child that day in Bethlehem. That's what they took home with them when they went home that day. And then T.S. Eliot ends the poem in a very stark way. He has that old Magi say, "I should be glad of another death." What is he talking about? Well, I'm not a literary critic, so just evaluating the poetry, I would not be able to figure that out for myself. I haven't been trained in doing that sort of thing. I also don't know what T.S. Eliot would say about it as the author, because I've never read anywhere where he has explained what he meant by that line. And maybe he did, but I've just never read it. But I can't tell you what I think. What I think is that he's writing as if these Magi are at the end of their life looking back on this event. Now, when the Magi would have come to Jesus, they would have been either in the prime of their life or already aging men by the time they came to Jesus. And so if they're looking back on this, it's maybe been 10 or 20 years, but Jesus doesn't start his ministry for 30 years after he's born. The significant events of Jesus' ministry would not happen in the lifetime of these Magi. Instead, as they're looking back on this, much of what Jesus came to do is still yet to be done. And so when he says, I should be glad of another death, is that old Magi talking about himself? I'd suggest that that is the words of faith, looking ahead at what the Christ child would do. Because if this Christ came to fulfill all the prophets had said about Christmas, and fulfilled the truth about where he was born, and that he brings the light of God into our lives and to all nations of the world, then the truth of Isaiah 53 is there too, that he would give his life as a ransom for many. And so when he says, I should be glad of another death, it's looking ahead to the death of the Christ. Paul says it this way in Romans chapter 5, verse 10. We who have been reconciled through the death of his Son, how much more, now that we have been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? This is the gift that brought those Magi into a new reconciled relationship with the one true God. The gift of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And this they went home with when they left Jesus that day at Bethlehem. Although it was kind of like a gift that was yet to be opened. One that had not been opened from its package yet, because it wouldn't be for another 30 years until Jesus would accomplish that for them. But you and I stand on the other side of that gift. And just like the Magi received that gift, and it brought them into a new relationship with their God, so we too have received it. And that gift has been opened, and we celebrate the same gifts of these Magi. We go home from Jesus with so much more than we have to bring. Oftentimes when it comes to Epiphany, we think about the wise men bringing their gifts to Jesus and laying it before them. We spend our time thinking about, well, what do I bring to Jesus? We even have Christmas carols about that, like the little drummer boy. What do we bring to Jesus? And what's most important is that unlike King Henry VIII's courts, and unlike the courts of Solomon when the Queen of Sheba came, we actually leave Jesus with more than we have to bring him. And here as we get to the end of this Christmas season, the last of these 12 days of Christmas, it's good to reflect and celebrate all of those gifts that we have, that we receive from him. No, we receive death to the sinful and selfish ways of this world. We receive new birth into life and peace through a Savior. We receive faith in the words of the Christ that come through the prophets in God's Word. We receive through forgiveness, through the light and glory of Christ. We receive wisdom in Jesus, the likes of which not even Solomon knew. And we receive hope, the kind that can only come from the King of Heaven himself. That's 6 things we receive. Were you hoping for 12? One for each of the 12 days of Christmas? There are more. I'll just let you find them and enumerate them, because actually there's more than we could count. There is more than we could even imagine. Gifts that we have received through Christ Jesus our Savior. So here, as we round out this Christmas season with this 12th day of Christmas, I invite you to enter into his gates with thanksgiving. Enter into his courts with praise. By the way, that's a carol from the days of Solomon's courts. It's called Psalm 100. But no matter what carol you use to do it, make sure, as this Christmas season rounds out, you are singing his praise. In Jesus' name. Amen.